acknowledgement of truth, of the internal truth, the inner truth that meets the need. What we then do is create lust, a thought from lust. Now lust is acting as the bridge between truth and a logic, where we don't intellectualize or use emotional empathy to meet our needs and then project that spirit through behavior. But what we do is begin to meet needs through hidden agendas, where then the self will lie, cheat, and steal to meet its need. Lie, cheat, and steal to meet its need because it's too afraid to speak its natural truth anymore. Like in childhood, we're born with the natural elements of the God Spirit inside the self. We're born with that. We learn the spirit-based response system to the spiritual elements of light through feeling, through the child, in each one of us feeling rejected for its natural expression of its elements of the God Spirit. Meaning, when the child expresses its truth and its emotional response through its innocence, but then is rejected for the darkness creation. The darkness of the spiritual response system creates itself, where then the self is now calculating thought with fear. So when the self is now calculating its thought with fear of the truth and its emotional response, we then are emptied of the spiritual fullness. The heart becomes dark, the mind becomes dark with the darkness of fear and fear of loss. Instead of intellectualizing the truth, which furthers knowledge, that gives us the light of a logic that concludes intellect's search for knowledge. But because the self is now afraid, instead of intellectualizing, we're calculating thought with the fears of losses, which then create the first lust to remain safe from that fear of loss. Where then the self uses a lust as the bridge from its truth to its logic, where it can then logic through a darkness of the light, the true light of logic, which brings us knowledge. So now, because we're in a lust mode, thinking through lust in our own hidden darkness, we're not telling anybody about this because behaviors calculated from lust do nothing but harm to ourselves and in our relationships, where we are then forced to lie, cheat, and steal to get our emotional needs met where they were once met through the spiritual fullness that God feeds us, as the result of the human will calculating its thought with truth and intellect and emotional wisdom, empathy. It's through lust that all human darkness is created. It's through lust that evil is created, and the son of the human will that calculates its thought with truth is intellect. Its result of that is intellect, where intellect will give us the awareness of our emotional wisdom, where then if we create an act of goodness through that emotional wisdom, through empathy, as this spiritual family of spiritual influences inside ourselves as one element, chosen through the will of the minds, chosen through the human will, as seen through the mind's eye of our human experience. So now, we are in duality of our spiritual response systems of the same truth, and its emotional response, the mother of our knowledge. Where intellects and emotional wisdom want to be the bridge to get to the logic that gives us the greater cognitive knowledge, as well as the greater knowledge of love, to project that through our human behavior. And that becomes a spiritual child in a way, when we project the spirit of thought's calculation from the heart of the self and from the truth of the self, projecting in the Holy Spirit, because it's coming from truth. Our behavior in thought is calculating the truth intellect with emotional wisdom and logic, filling the heart with a spiritual fullness called a pleroma. And the self is content. But when we listen to fear's communication to the human will of the self, as seen through the mind's eye of the inner self, gives birth to a lust. How do I say this? And if the human will calculates with its lust over the intellect and wisdom, this self is darkened in its heart, it's darkened in its truth, its ignorance, and it's empty of the spiritual fullness, leaving this self feeling always a spiritual hunger that then needs to be filled when it's not interacting with its elements of the God Spirit as one element. This lust leaves the heart in a spiritual hunger for that fullness. The self doesn't really know what it is hungry for or why it's hungry. It just knows that it's been separated from its God Spirit and it's now empty and feeling emptiness, sadness, sorrow, pain, unresolved pain, because none of the emotional knowledge is acknowledged and then expressed, which completes the emotional response through our reaction if we speak it and express it. That's how we complete the emotional response through our reaction, and then the heart is filled with a spiritual fullness because we have knowledge. It's knowledge that fills us with spiritual fullness. But if we're disconnected to our spiritual elements of light because we're paying all the attention to our fear of the truth, then we give birth to its result, which is the human will of the self, the masculine thought of the self, and fear, calculating thought with a dark feminine influence of the evil spirit influence inside people, giving birth to its result, which is lust. Lust then tells the human will of the self to keep its emotional truth hidden and not express. Therefore, not expressing its emotional truth, which is the mother of all our knowledge. That can't use intellect and wisdom as the bridge to get to the light in logic. So now the self is calculating with the dark feminine, giving birth to a lust, making the self look for physical substances to fill the empty spaces in our hearts and in our roots of truth. There. Living in our duality. We must learn to reconnect our spiritual elements to our human will again, like it was in early childhood before the rejection stage. The rejection stage is the conversion from the natural elements of the God Spirit inside self, already connected to the mind's eye of the child, as the child naturally joins all its elements of the God Spirit inside itself as one element through its mind's eye. And it doesn't create its darkness or even the knowing of its fear until this expression of the spiritual knowledge is spoken through the word, the spoken word of the child. And if that child is then rejected for that spiritual expression, creates the first fear. And the first fear is telling its mind's eye, don't express anything of your God Spirit and element because all they do is reject you. And it hurts. So the child then starts listening to its dark feminine instead of its sacred feminine element of the God Spirit within. And all hell breaks loose after that.